And we're back. How's it going, everybody? Owen here. Let me just test my audio. Looks like everything is working. So I'll give people a few minutes to um, filter in if they want. If you could let me know in the comments if you can hear me okay, that would be appreciated. If you can see me, let me know as well, because that shouldn't be happening. So, as the title indicates, Catholics, contraception, and the problem of the fundamental option. Um, so I made it almost a month into 2025 before I was officially accused of being a heretic. It's something that tends to happen kind of regularly in the quote unquote line of work that I do as a um, podcaster that refers to himself as Catholic. I guess other people apparently take issue with that, but I'm a practicing Catholic, been Catholic all my life. Um, Plan to always be Catholic, raise my kids Catholic, all that good stuff. But, sometimes it's just not enough for some people. So, anyway, the the other day, I'm gonna try and pull up the tweets here. So the other day, someone was talking. I'm not gonna say who it was, but a pretty good sized channel, Catholic channel on Twitter, was addressing and responding to the contraception issue, and was pointing out that um, whereas contraception interferes with the proper ends of the conjugal act, NFP does not, and that's why one is okay and the other isn't. And I know that is more or less the line of thought that the popes have used. Um, I guess more recently, to explain why contraception is not permitted, but under certain circumstances, natural family planning can be. It's based on the presupposition or conclusion that procreation or the possibility of procreation is inherent to the conjugal act, and for that reason, it is a grave violation of nature to engage in the conjugal act, i.e., have sex, if procreation is in any way thwarted, at least unnaturally. Things such as barrier methods, hormonal birth controls, IUDs, the good old own and special, the pull out, all of that is considered um, to be a violation of the inherent end and purpose of the conjugal act. So the foundation for the teachings, at least recently, I know I said recently in the last century or so, but the foundation for the teaching against contraception has been, at least the way it's been articulated, is in these terms of the proper end and violations of the end, which, for lack of a better word, is referred to as teleology. It's a concept of philosophy slash theology that has its roots as far back as Aristotle, but really picked up steam with Augustine, and probably most notably St. Thomas Aquinas in the, the 13th century. I think he lived in the 1200s. And more or less that concept has carried through in sort of uh, varying iterations up through the present day, and probably most notably and most recently being Humani Vitae in 1968 by Pope Paul VI. So when you hear Catholics talk about the church's teaching on birth control, it more or less revolves around that concept that the conjugal act has a sort of an unavoidable proper end that is oriented towards procreation. Doesn't mean that, well, at least recently, doesn't have to be for procreation. In the past, it was more or less had to be for procreation. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But even if you're not trying to get pregnant, the possibility of pregnancy is always supposed to be preserved in each and every single conjugal act. And that's going to be an important, hey, midnight, that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that each and every single act, regardless of the circumstances, has to quote unquote be open to procreation. Okay. So it's based, I would say, almost entirely on an assessment of the act itself, and um, is said to not depend on the circumstances of the couple, their intentions, their state in life, et cetera, et cetera. That's the way that, at least that's the way I understand it. And so it even so because of that, it's a very black and white rule. You don't mess with the conjugal act, and regardless of the reasons or regardless of the hazards of pregnancy, none of that matters, because the end of the conjugal act is so ingrained in the act by God that you can't mess with that. And if you do, it's not only sinful, it's gravely sinful, and with done with full knowledge and consent is a mortal sin. So that's from my perspective, I think that's a pretty fair sort of summary of the current quote unquote teaching as it pertains to contraception as set forth in Humani Vitae, as well as some of the subsequent encyclicals of Pope John Paul II. Now, so what got me in trouble the other day, and what got me accused of being a heretic, is when I responded to that post, and I said, and I'm not going to put it on the screen for you, but I'm going to read it for you. And I firmly believe this. And before I repeat what I said, let me be clear here. I am not a theologian. I am barely a philosopher, but I'm not a theologian. Obviously, don't take any moral theological advice from me. I'm just speaking based on my own experience and intuition and desire to be a good and, more importantly, an honest Catholic. Okay. So I'm speaking from a point of honesty and transparency. And I recognize that perhaps some of the comments that I make may make people feel uncomfortable. And, talk to someone who knows more about this than I do, for reaching your own conclusions. But I want to just offer some food for thought here. So, with respect to this original post, the distinction between, contraception, which artificially interferes with the procreative end, versus an NFP, I made the comment. I said these are great philosophical distinctions, but don't really make a lot of sense in the real world of Catholic marriage. Which means that, yeah, I think it's fine to talk about the ends of marriage and the difference between, let's say, NFP and contraception from an academic perspective. But in the actual real world, those distinctions don't, I mean, they don't really mean much in the real life situation of married couples, at least in my experience. I think it is very much based on our circumstances in life and things like that. Now, I'm not saying that to say that, well, morality is circumstantial. I'm just saying that these philosophical distinctions really don't mean a hill of beans when it comes to the actual day to day decision making of married couples. At least that's my experience. So then I added a tweet, and this is what got me in trouble with the heretic police. I said the fundamental option, and I'll talk about the fundamental option here in a moment. The fundamental option, and I said full disclosure, rejected by the church, which evaluates a marriage from whether it's fruitful overall, is a far more plausible and compelling approach than distinguishing acts based on, and I put in parentheses, antiquated notions of teleology, irrespective of the particular circumstances of the couple or their intentions. Okay, that was my point. And I was referring to the fundamental option within the context of the contraception issue, even though, as I'll explain here in a moment, the fundamental option has sort of a more broader context, and that's actually not what I was referring to. And I think that's maybe where the heretic police maybe missed the point here. So let me try and make the point. So anyway, after that, one of my friends on Twitter chimed in and said, "This is a heretical statement. Period. The church is right to reject fundamental option, and here you are promoting it as if you know more than the church. Delete this post, Craig Onan, and soften your heart so that you don't go to hell over something as stupid as this." Okay, well, and I responded and I said, "Hey, thanks for the fraternal concern. I don't think I said anything heretical, and I'm more concerned about being honest and transparent than I am about, um, I guess, saying the right thing for better for worse." So anyway, so stepping back here, and I'm not necessarily an expert on these concepts, but I've seen them enough, and I looked them up, and I think this is a fair way to talk about it. So the fundamental option in general terms is the moral theory that we will be judged after death based on an overall evaluation of whether we have been oriented towards God, whether we have been oriented with virtue, or whether we have generally been oriented towards evil. I think that is more or less how the fundamental option works. It says we're not going to look at particular acts or particular wrongs. We're really more, God is going to be more concerned with overall, have you been sort of with God or against God? That I think that is more or less what the fundamental option means. And yes, the church, as far as I know, has rejected the fundamental option as a way of evaluating our judgment as it pertains to sins we commit in this life. Okay. What does that mean? That means that you can live an otherwise virtuous life, but if you commit one mortal sin before you die, and hey, Picken, good to see you. But if you commit one mortal sin in your life and you don't confess it before death, that one single mortal sin can be enough, and let's say probably is enough to damn your soul for eternity, irrespective of how virtuous the other 99.9% of your life was. So that is the rejection of the fundamental option in a general sense, that it's not enough that you are mostly virtuous. What matters is the state of your soul and the state of your conscience at the moment of death, right? And so a single sin can sink you. And so when they say the church has rejected the fundamental option, that's more or less what they mean. Okay. The fundamental option, however, was more or less used as in a different way, sort of the same, but definitely different within the context of the conversation over contraception, in particular in the 1950s and 1960s, when the church, um, yeah, that's right. Just one morsel, and I don't mean to be flippant about it, but that is, I believe, more or less what the church seems to seems to teach. But so Casti Connubii, I forget which pope it was, Pius the 11th, I believe, like the 1930s. I don't have the exact date in front of me. I can look it up. Casti Connubii came out really in 1930 in response to the Anglican Church's approval, at least in a limited circumstance, approval of contraception at the Lambeth Conference in 1930. And Pope Pius the 11th immediately wrote Casti Connubii in response to that, in reaction to that. I don't know that it was necessarily on his radar to talk about contraception at that point, but I guess he felt compelled to do so, given the um, effect of the Anglican Church sort of departing from more or less the consistent Christian faith up until that point in time, which was against contraception. Okay. So this was in 1930, and in the grand scheme of thing, it was still a fairly new encyclical in the 1960s. So when the Second Vatican Council was rolling around, and as I understand it, having read, I can't think of the name of the book. If I think of it, I'll mention it. But it was a book about the commission that John the 23rd, and then when he died, Paul the Sixth brought together to address specifically the issue of hormonal birth control, as opposed to, I think, contraception in general. They were asking, is hormonal birth control, which is essentially relying upon a natural hormone present in nature in a woman's body, is it okay to use that to space ovulation in children? And is that to be distinguished from, let's say, other forms of contraception and birth control before that? That was more or less, I believe, what gave rise to what would end up being Humani Vitae in 1968. So there was a lot of talk at the Second Vatican Council at the beginning of wanting to address it at the council, and as I understand it, uh, John the 23rd didn't want anything to do with it, and it brought this um, brought this to this commission together to basically advise them, and then at a later date, such as an encyclical or whatever, they would address the issue of birth control. And so so this commission was called together, and I don't need to dwell too much on it, but what I'll summarize to say is this commission, which was made up of, and it kind of organically developed over time. It started out mostly as theologians, so celibate theologians and philosophers. Um, and then they initially added a couple of lay married couples, and then I think expanded that over time. And as I understand it from the book, um, the sort of attitude of the commission dramatically changed from the beginning to the end, with at the beginning being very much against the idea of permitting contraception, or at least the hormonal birth control. And then by the end, almost the overwhelming majority um, thought that the church ought to permit, at least in some circumstances, the hormonal birth control. Ultimately, for better or for worse, Pope Paul VI basically went against the opinions of the commission and issued a Humani Vitae, which more or less reaffirmed Humani Vitae, and I would say more or less put the kibosh on any further discussion about contraception. Around this same time, well, one of the notable critics, and there was actually a lot of critics of Humani Vitae and even Casti Connubii, but one of the more notable critics of Humani Vitae when it came out was a theologian called, I believe his name is Robert Curran. Don't think he was like a clergy, but I'm not sure if he was married. But he was a very highly educated theologian slash philosopher, I believe at Catholic University. I'm not sure. I believe he may have been around since around the time of Casti Connubii. I think he's still alive, but he's like 90 years old now. So maybe he was a little after Casti Connubii, but he was certainly in the sort of the middle of his career when Humani Vitae came out, and was um, became kind of a lightning rod of being critical of Humani Vitae and its sort of reliance upon teleology and focus on particular acts as opposed to, let's say, the circumstances of the couple. Now, in couple things to fully disclose here. Number one, Robert Curran was eventually, I don't think he was excommunicated, but he basically had his permission to teach theology revoked by Ratzinger, who was, I believe, head of the Congregation of the Faith at that time. Um, and so he has been repudiated. There was one other thing. Can't remember what the other point I was going to make, but um, you know, he is, he- the authority of the church, at least Pope Cardinal Ratzinger at that time has condemned Curran. But oh yeah, here's the other thing. Curran was also known to be more, um, what do I say, open to dialogue about other issues, not just contraception, but let's say homosexuality, even abortion. So he was, I would say, uh, far more libertarian on a whole variety of moral issues, not just the contraception issue. I sometimes wonder if he had limited his emphasis on just contraception and the criticism of Humanae Vitae, if possibly he would have had a little more success. But I think once he started straying into these other things, I think it more or less made his ideas dead on arrival. So, but one of the things that I think Curran brought up, and he wasn't the only one, but they and this is the point I was trying to make in this tweet. The fundamental option within this context basically says, at least the theory is that, why are we judging individual acts? Why are we judging each individual act as opposed to the couple's fruitfulness as a whole? And looking at the overall fruitfulness of the marriage as opposed to each and every single time they come together in the conjugal act. And so that was, I think, I think that's what how the term fundamental option was being used, and that's what I was referring to when I was making my comments on Twitter. Is it does seem to there is something elegant about the idea of asking about the marriage as a whole and its fruitfulness, for a few reasons that I want to talk about here. Um, so number one, and maybe most importantly, when you get married in the church, you take a series of vows. You promise to love each other. Well, I don't know if you do promise to love each other, but you promise to be faithful to each other until death. The marriage is indissoluble. Uh, Honor and obedience, all that kind of stuff. But there's one vow that you make, and I remember this very well when I got married. You promise to welcome children lovingly and raise them in the faith. I don't know if there are different variations of it in different, let's see, liturgical manuals or whatever. But oh yeah, so the other one is, you have to promise that you've come here freely. You take marriage in good times and in bad, sickness and health. But the one that stood out is the priest or deacon asks, "Will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up in according to the law of the Christ and his church?" So that vow, which deals with the idea of procreation, says, welcome children lovingly. It doesn't say make sure each and every time you engage in the conjugal act, it's open to life. So you don't make the vow to make every act open to life. You make a vow to welcome children and to accept children lovingly from God, which to me makes a lot of sense. And it's especially true when you apply the concept that we're going to judge each and every individual act and assess it under circumstances where procreation obviously can't happen. So, for example, when you're already pregnant, if you engage in the conjugal act during pregnancy, you cannot get re-pregnant. So, why exactly it would still be a gravely immoral act to use, let's say, a condom during pregnancy is not really very clear to me. I think this is where the teleology starts to um, show its vulnerabilities. Let's say after menopause, after a hysterectomy, situations like that where procreation is impossible, and yet each conjugal act is supposed to, not be interfered with from the standpoint of procreation, even though procreation is impossible. So I just only point that out to show that this focus on individual acts, at least in my own personal view, tends to break down greatly when you apply it in those circumstances. That's just me. To me, that just doesn't seem to be a really good explanation for why using contraception when procreation is impossible is wrong. That's just my own observation. But let's get back to the whole, the general duty, or the vow that you make at marriage to accept children lovingly from God. And let me show you how I think, at least I would look at the fundamental option as a better way. It seems to me a better, or at least a more plausible way to judge the morality of the couple's actions than individual acts. Let's say you've got two couples. Two couples are married, they're validly married, they love God, they love each other, they're committed to each other, and they want to be open to life. And let's say God wills both of those couples to have 9 kids. So I have 9 kids, so I'm going to use 9. So let's say we can know for certain that God wants both of those couples to have 9 children. That's God's will. God has a special purpose for each of those 18 children. And each of those couples know that and willingly accepts each of their 9 children. So at the end of their marriage, or at the end of their fruitful days of their marriage, they've each produced the 9 children that God willed for them. Couple A spaced things out so they had only 9 children, not 10 children, 11 children, but they had their 9 children by using contraception at some point during the marriage. That's couple A. Couple B, let's say, used natural family planning, such as in my situation, to have 9 children as opposed to 10, 11, 12, whatever the case may be. Same result, same level of fruitfulness, but the one couple has used contraception and the other couple has used NFP to bring about the fulfillment of God's will for them, which is to have 9 kids. So why is it that the couple that uses contraception to get to the end result, which is God's will, is sinful or engaging in sin, but the couple that uses NFP is not necessarily engaging in sin, right? To me, that is where the fundamental option, if we could apply it to determine whether something is sinful. So this is where I think I'm not really even a heretic on the strictest sense of the word. I'm not even talking about the fundamental option from the standpoint of judging how God is actually going to look at our sins. Here, the fundamental option is intertwined with the question of whether it's a sin at all. So whether contraception or whatever the case may be is a sin at all, I think is a much different question. And that's where I think this concept is seems much more consistent with reason and experience than this sort of old teleology ends and things like that, because it at least matches up with the one vow that we take as couples on our wedding day with respect to openness to life. It actually mirrors it perfectly. So why is it that the couple that uses contraception at some point during their marriage, but nonetheless fulfills their marriage vow to accept children lovingly from God and has the 9 children that God wills for them, how are they displeasing to God? But the other couple who did the exact same thing, fulfilled their marriage vow, had the children that God wanted of them, but used NFP, why is that okay? Why is the one okay and the other not? Why is God pleased with the one and not pleased with the other? That, I think, is the part the issue that we have to contend with. We have to be able to contend with that because I'm telling you from my own experience, and I get messages regularly from people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike. And in particular, I get messages from non-Catholics who are looking at the faith and find something in the church that they've been missing all their lives until they stumble upon this stuff, and it makes no sense to them, and tends to be the final barrier and sometimes an insurmountable barrier to them fully joining the church because in their mind this distinction doesn't make sense. And I think we have to be okay with, as Catholics, acknowledging that this distinction doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Completely separate issue from whether the teaching is to be followed or not. Just so we're clear, I'm not telling anyone to use contraception. I'm not saying that at all. I've never used contraception. At this point, I'm not planning to. We're closer to menopause than we not. And so, but I don't think that means we have to just sit idly by and say, and repeat these platitudes that these teleological distinctions that have their origins as far back as Augustine make perfect sense when they really don't. If we're really being honest with ourselves, they don't really make a lot of sense. Now, does that matter? Does it matter if the rules are based on reasoning that doesn't make sense? And I know some will say it doesn't matter if the reasoning is wrong. The rule is to be followed. Okay, fine. But would the rule have been the rule without this reasoning? I tend to think not. I mean, it's really hard for me. I don't think you can put that toothpaste back in the tube. Now, if you ask my own personal opinion, and this is just my, let's say, potentially heretical opinion, but my own personal opinion is that the reason why the popes, and I'm going to say the popes rather than the church, because I think there's some reasonable disagreement as to whether Humani Vitae or whatever is in fact infallible, authoritative teaching that absolutely has to be followed. I don't know. That's way, way, way above my pay grade. So I'm going to talk about what the popes say as opposed to what the church says because I think that could be distinguishable. But I think the popes have for better or for worse, whether purposely or not, sort of clung to this teleological approach to individual conjugal acts as opposed to looking at the overall fruitfulness for a couple of reasons. Number one, and I think this is probably a very real reason, is they are afraid that this could open the door to permitting, let's say, sexual activities outside the context of a monogamous heterosexual marriage, such as gay relationships and stuff like that. I fully expect that that is part of the reasoning is they're afraid of opening that door, and maybe it would. I don't know, but to me, that should not be the reason for applying the rule in this case. The rule should be applied on its own merits, not because of concern about the ripple effects later. That's my own personal opinion. Take it for what it's worth. But I think the second and other really, really important is I don't know how else the church avoids the popes. Let's say the popes avoid repudiating St. Thomas Aquinas and probably more importantly, St. Augustine. St. Augustine's a doctor of the church. But if you look at St. Augustine, and I've got some of his materials sitting in front of me, like it or not, he was pretty down on sex, and I don't think St. Augustine would ever give his blessing to Humani Vitae. St. Augustine was a complicated guy, right? He had lived a pretty fleshly life. Famously had a concubine. I think suffered with sexual passions all his life, and absolutely seem to have influenced his views of sex and marriage. Also going around that time was the Manichees, I believe. Again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I've read enough to I think I understand this correctly. The Manichees were a heretical group within the church who I think very much saw the earth, sort of earthly existence, as evil, um, and thought that it was a sinful thing to bring new life into this world. So they were really against procreation, but they were fine with sex. And so they were fine with having sex for the sake of having sex, but didn't want any procreation to result from it. And so I think there was all kinds of stories about kind of sordid activities taking place at Manichae events. And so Augustine was reacting to that. And he kind of went in the opposite direction. I think for Augustine, he thought all sex was bad. I'm not just saying he think. I mean, it's pretty clear in his writings. He thought sex was bad and really to be avoided if at all possible. But basically, they tolerate sex, they tolerate the conjugal act as long as procreation is the purpose of it, and not even, let's see, openness to it. It is you have to be coming together for procreation, and I believe this is correct. Augustine said that you should really avoid experiencing the pleasure of orgasm during sex. And if you do, even if you are coming together for purposes for the express purpose of procreation, if you get too much pleasure out of it, it's probably a venial sin at at least, at a minimum. And I think I'm pretty confident Augustine would say if you're only having sex for any reason other than for the express purpose of making a baby, not simply that you're having sex, but you're open to getting pregnant if you get pregnant. But if you're not coming together expressly for purpose of making a baby, and you're doing it for other reasons, unity, pleasure, comfort, all that kind of stuff, I think you would say that's a gravely immoral matter. That is in Augustine's lineage, and Augustine very much was a foundation for Aquinas, and is really carried on up until Humanae Vitae. And I think from what I can tell, hanging on to this teleological apparatus that has procreation as an let's see, inseparable component of the conjugal act is the way that the popes have been able to kind of walk that tightrope of not necessarily endorsing all of Augustine's stuff, but not having to repudiate him entirely. So what do they do? So why do they allow NFP and not contraception when, as I for the couple, the example I talked about before, you could have two couples have the exact same number of children, exactly the number of kids that God wants for them, but one uses contraception and one uses NFP. Why is one allowed and not the other? I think we all kind of know why it is. NFP is a lot more difficult. The couple that's using contraception is probably enjoying sex a lot more than the couple that's using NFP, and there seems to be infused in our history as Catholics this strong skepticism, not even just skepticism, but really contempt for sexual enjoyment, and it's only tolerated if it results in human life. I think if we're really being honest with ourselves, I think if you put Pope Paul VI, or even John Paul II on a polygraph, I think he would acknowledge that. That's just me. That's just my own personal opinion. By requiring that the conjugal act always be open to life, more or less, the popes have built in a governor. For those of you who don't know what a governor is, they don't make them on cars anymore, but I'm old enough to know what a governor is. It's a thing that basically allows the car to only go so fast, only allows so much fuel into the system. So it's a top end protection against a certain amount of speed or acceleration. So it's a built-in governor from couples having too much enjoyable sex in their marriage, because you're going to end up having a bunch of kids. So, fine. If you want to do that and you produce a whole bunch of kids, fine. We're okay with that. But they know that people aren't going to use NFP unless they absolutely have to, because NFP is a real drag. I don't care. I don't care who you ask, especially if you ask men. NFP is a drag. It just is, and I think it's allowed because it's a drag. I think that is. I don't think that's a bug. I think that's a feature of the Pope's, um, albeit late permissiveness of NFP, is that it's such a drag that no one is going to use it unless they absolutely have to, and it's, I think, really really difficult, if not impossible, to abuse NFP for any prolonged period of time. I've yet to meet a couple that is, kind of lived a selfish life and had, let's say, no kids or maybe a kid or two, and used NFP throughout the entirety of their marriage. That I just don't think that actually exists. I think that's a kind of a fairy tale approach. So, what does that mean? So, I guess, kind of taken a maul hammer to this stuff, and I sorry if that offends people, if that is an unnecessarily deconstructionist approach to things. But let me take this moment to transition to what I think actually is a much more compelling, plausible defense of the church's position against contraception. Now, I don't think this is what the popes have said. This is just purely Onan's theory, but I would feel much more comfortable if the popes offered this as an explanation for why you can't use contraception. I think this would actually present a viable alternative to the world that most people, could actually wrap their head around and embrace, even though it wouldn't be easy. It would be manageable, unlike, I think, NFP for most of us. So, if the popes came out, the popes asked me, he said, Onan, what would be your best argument for why Catholics, and anyone but Catholics, shouldn't use contraception? Here would be my general assessment. Um, the conjugal act is an amazing thing. Nothing will ever replace it. No, and I can say this from experience. There are a few things that compare with the conjugal act when you are in the process of bringing another life into the world. There is something inescapably magical about that. And even though my wife and I are now at the point where we probably are done having kids, I do feel a little sad about that, because there is something inescapably magical about having that, um, to participating with God's creation in that way. So nothing will ever, um, top that in my experience. So it is something that is amazing and magical and very much a cooperation in the creative powers of God. And if you are and it should be treated as sacred. And if you're going to engage in the conjugal act, treat it as something as sacred. And if God wanted us to be able to use the conjugal act in a different way, such as with contraception, pills, hormones, things like that, God would have given us those tools from the beginning of creation. But as I mentioned in other videos, contraception, at least reliable contraception, is a very, very modern, um, invention, in the last 120 years or so. So to me, I think there's a really good argument that if you look at the whole of history, there's no indication that God wanted us to use the conjugal act and artificially remove its procreative capacity. Now, that's only half of it. And this is where I think the popes, the church, if you will, whoever, I think maybe have missed the point. And this is really really important. For the same reason that I can see how God created the conjugal act to always have this procreative, creative element to it and should be treated with respect and whatever, I think it also seems apparent that that God gave us all the other ways, other very natural, harmless, beneficial ways of expressing ourselves sexually with our spouses or, if necessary, with our spouses when the conjugal act is simply not appropriate or not available to us. If couples have other options available to them, it is a sacrifice. It will always be a sacrifice, but it's a bearable sacrifice. And it kind of reinforces the sacredness of the conjugal act by recognizing that, you know what, using our reason and our power of discipline and whatever, we are going to forego the conjugal act because now is not a good time for us to get pregnant, but we're going to at least fill in part the needs that we have. And this is, I want to bring up something that Midnight mentioned earlier, you know. The dismissal of the notion of sexual needs. I don't know that humans have a need for sex per se, or the conjugal act or intercourse. I do think humans have an actual real need for sexual intimacy, sexual enjoyment, sexual release, whatever. I actually personally think that is a need for most people, at least sexually active people. Maybe for a celibate it's different, but I think for those of us are married that are at least intermittently sexually active, I think sexual expression and sexual enjoyment in some form is a need, even if the conjugal act itself is not a need. Now, the church, well, let's say, I don't want to say the church, but the Pope sort of boxed us in. If these other sexual expressions, such as other acts, solo acts, or whatever, are off the table, then what that does in effect is it says if you're going to engage in sexual activity at all, it has to be the conjugal act. Well, what does that do? In my opinion, it actually diminishes the sacredness of the conjugal act, because now it is the only way for individuals and couples to fulfill any of their sexual needs, most of which are very unrelated to procreation itself, right? Our sexual needs continue even when procreation is not possible, after menopause, during pregnancy, postpartum, all that kind of stuff. I believe from my own experience that there are sexual needs that continue. And how are those fulfilled? They can't be fulfilled in the conjugal act most of the time. And so I believe the sexual appetite, that there are real sexual needs, even if it's not um you know the conjugal act. But if the standard is you must only express yourself sexually in the conjugal act and you must not use contraception, I think that is creating a structure that is just so devoid of reason and so separated from the actual experience of couples. And this is why so many people struggle to embrace fully what the church has said about contraception in the past. Hmm. Good to see you, Jonah. You'll have to go back and watch the replay if you want all the heresy. I think I'm all kind of heresied out. Well, I guess this, depending who you ask. Good to see you. But so this is a real, I think this is a real problem for the church. And it's probably easy for me to say what the solution ought to be. Uh, the the popes have kind of painted themselves into a corner. When Humani Vitae came out, I know, whether the popes would admit it or not, whether Pope Paul VI would admit it or not, I know that the recency of Casti Connubii was a significant factor in the decision to kind of maintain the status quo. Had Casti Connubii not occurred, and this was the first time the church was really dealing with the issue of contraception in any capacity, I think it's more likely that the result would have been differently, but I think there was a very, very real fear of losing credibility, and this is stated as much in the minutes from these meetings, that the arguments given by the quote unquote minority of the birth control commission, those that ultimately ruled the day, there was actually no substance offered for the 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 prohibition on contraception beyond this is the way it is always been or been for a long time, and it could create a credibility crisis for the church if they were to essentially reverse course 30 to 40 years after Casti Connubii. Well, like it or not, I think the church has a credibility crisis on its hands because look at what's happened. Despite what they did, despite all the warnings and predictions, almost nobody uses NFP. Um, Most couples either use contraception or don't use anything at all. Um, so I'm not sure what they gained other than a lot of people called the bluff and just said we're going to use contraception anyway. Now, I'm not here to say that Pope Paul VI was wrong, and I'm glad I wasn't the one that had to make that call. But I think, as a Catholic, as someone who's every day of my life is affected in some way by what happened with Humani Vitae, I have to point out the real problems with the way the popes have gone about explaining and justifying their position on these matters. I am very sympathetic to those who find these explanations just entirely um, unsatisfying, I guess, for lack of a better word. I'm really glad. Yeah. Yeah. You know what, Jonah? Let me tell you about that. Okay. And this is much more my wife's burden in life than mine. But our ninth child, and God willing, our last child, continues to be an absolute, what do I want to say? I got to choose my words carefully here. Just a real anomaly. So yesterday, so she's 2.5. Um, she did not get a nap during the day, and she fell asleep at about 7:30 at night. Which, hey, that must sound great to everybody. You know what? But you know what happens? You know what happens every single time? She wakes up about 9 o'clock p.m. and then she was up until well after 12:30 in the morning. Um, that's what happens. And I went to bed eventually. My wife, stayed up with her. At some point, I came downstairs to go to the bathroom. My wife is sitting on the couch sleeping, and the 2-year-old is still on the couch watching TV. So yeah, kids are a blessing. All of my kids are a blessing, but they are. I just wish that Paul VI could watch my kids for just a day. Just watch my kids for a day and just understand what couples actually go through in the enormous sacrifices we're already making on a regular basis just to try and keep people alive and fed. And that I think is the part that really gets lost in all of this is these all this talk about ends and teleology and nature and all that. You know what? None of that matters at all at 12:30 in the morning when you're trying to get to sleep and your toddler won't go to sleep. So, I don't know. I don't know where this leaves us. I when I first got married, I had consumed the Christopher West theology of the body Kool-Aid. I was so excited to be doing the right thing and being a good Catholic and not being those terrible people that use contraception. I was going to be so much better than them. And then reality set in. And while we've never used contraception, and quite honestly, even if the church permitted it, I wouldn't run down to the drugstore to get it, because I actually do think there are some legitimate concerns with contraception that you know I think some of the warnings or concerns that Paul VI had in Humanae Vitae were valid. But if the answer is to basically more or less adopt Augustine's very extreme positions on life, I don't know that that's any better. I think, uh, I think just as many harms come to the marriage, if not more, to the marriage, trying to live under these arduous circumstances than the harm that can and may very well come to marriages where the couples are using contraception and can be very much run the risk of becoming selfish and all that. That would be my concern. That's my own personal concern about contraception, is that at least with natural family planning, um, there's 2 weeks out of the month. Sorry, Siri. There's 2 weeks out of the month where I can't be intimate with my wife as much as I would want to. Um, it's the question about whether that means we have to live like hermits in between. That is really where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion. If 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 the church said no contraception, but so don't be messing with the conjugal act, but use your discretion and reason to um, you know fill your sexual needs to some degree, within reason, of course. Um, I would, I would, I would be the biggest fan and advocate of that approach, but that doesn't seem to be the approach that's given, and so I am a very much a reluctant um, soldier as it comes to the current state of affairs, which is no contraception, but also none of this other stuff. At least that's my own feeling. So, what do you mean? The other acts and stuff would be used as contraception, Jonah? Is that what you mean? I mean, that's what abstinence is contraception. I mean, okay, well, so why do you care? So why does it matter? Why is it in your mind? Why is it okay for a couple to not have sex at all to avoid pregnancy, but it's bad for them to use some of these other acts as a substitute for the conjugal act? Like, why is abstinence okay? Assuming you think abstinence is okay, I think even you would agree to that, but other acts are not. Like, why? What? Tell me the reason for that, other than just don't like the idea of couples enjoying some sexual pleasure without pregnancy being a risk. Yeah, that's pay to play. Yeah, I don't know. That's dumb. Sorry, Jonah. That's just. I mean, that's just masochism. I mean, again, you are more or less like Augustine, who said, "Hey, if you're gonna have any kind of sexual enjoyment, then you better be risking babies." I mean, that is Augustine right there. You are very much adopting Augustine's approach. That is just, I don't know. I'm sorry, it's absurd. I think it's just absurd. That's just my own feeling. So, and the other thing I would say is this, to get back to Jonah's comp. Let me see. Now, how do I use? I have very, very limited experience with other acts. Let me just say that. Okay. Um, but I know enough about them from talking to other people that I I believe for most people, even the best other act is going to be not as great as the conjugal act itself. If you could choose, I think almost everyone would basically choose to engage in the full conjugal act, which listen, Jonah. Let me this. I think this directly um, refutes your point. If other acts are just contraception, then why doesn't everyone just use other acts? Why do people use contraception? The reason people use contraception is because sex is better, right? People that don't have a problem with contraception are probably not going to have a problem with other acts and are probably doing both. And yet they realize that other acts are just they're just not the same thing, right? So you will never phase out the conjugal act, at least in my own personal opinion, no matter how much you tinker and experiment with other acts. That's my own personal feeling. If other people think I'm wrong, I mean, go right ahead. But that, to me, that whole fear that, well, that'll just make it too easy for people. I just don't think there's any evidence to support that. And even if it did, how do we know that's not just God's genius saying, "Look, I got you covered, folks. Yes, it's going to be hard not to be able to have sex anytime you want. But here, I gave you hands and mouths and reason to be able to take care of things." I mean, that to me makes a lot of sense in my opinion, but who am I? Okay. But here again, Jonah, couples still have a duty. I know you missed part of this. Couples have a duty to welcome children lovingly from God. So, what are you saying? Here's what you're saying, Jonah. We don't want to make it too easy for people to not have children. So, rather than change their hearts, rather than persuading people that they should have more children, we're more or less going to trick them into it by making it impossibly difficult for them to avoid having kids. That's essentially what you're saying. It's better for people to have more kids than they actually want than it is to persuade people why, you know what, maybe you actually can handle more kids than you have. That is just, I just can't even get over how short-sighted that view of things is, even though I think you're right. I think more or less that is how the popes that have approached this. We can't convince you it's a good thing to have a bunch of kids, so we're more or less going to like force you into it because it's impossible to do otherwise without contraception. I mean, that's, yeah, see, that's where you and I are going to have to really disagree on this one, Jonah. I just think that is, wow. I mean, no wonder people don't take us seriously. I mean, like, really, this is our approach. Yeah, we're we need more babies, and we think you're not going to have enough babies, so we're more or less going to force you into it, by just making it impossibly difficult for you to do anything otherwise. Is that really what we want? Is that really what we want? Is a bunch of couples having more kids than they ever want, rather than creating an atmosphere they can knowingly and choose to have children? Shouldn't we all want our children? Shouldn't every children be born into a marriage where the couple wants them and went out of their way to have them, as opposed to, ah, crap, we got tired of waiting, our sexual impulses got the better of us, and we had sex, so we produced you. Wow. How did how is that not messed up? Oh, come on. No. Ugh, Jonah, there's no new comparison. I've never once had a difficult time getting to mass on Sunday, even though it was an inconvenience. Uh, Now, I will say, getting to mass is kind of a challenge, and you have 9 kids. So I don't know. Pick your poison there. You want me going to mass, or you want me having all these kids? Yeah, midnight's exactly correct. Like, I just think we really, not we, because I don't really fit myself in this camp, but I think people really, in many ways, cheapen sex, cheapen the conjugal act, cheapen procreation, cheapen and really minimize it and make it just kind of a functional, mm, almost a utilitarian thing. We need more bodies, whatever. I just think I think underlying all this is a really kind of a sick utilitarianism that I thought as Catholics we're not supposed to employ. I just feel very, very strong that under almost any circumstances, people that do things willingly and voluntarily are just that's just a much, much better situation than people that are kind of forced to do something under duress. It's the reason why we don't force people to convert to the faith under punishment of death. Like I suppose you probably in favor of the Inquisition too, huh, Jonah? I think Pickens is exactly right there. Like I once thought before I got married that the couples that didn't use NFP and use contraception were just a bunch of selfish, um, whatever. Um, that that is just not really true. I think it's a caricature that we've created either purposely or unwittingly to kind of justify this um, pretty, you know, um, pretty offensive, structure we have. You know, I think couples that resort to, I mean, the how many couples do you know of that have used contraception to never have kids at all? There are plenty of couples that have been unable to have kids or whatever, but very few never have kids. No, and those that choose not to probably have a good reason not to. I think most people would like to bring children to the world, and maybe because of their circumstances in life just feel like they can't bring kids into it. But I think if they could replace that for a set of circumstances where they could have kids, I think most people would have kids. And in contraception, I just think it's shown by most people that use contraception do have kids, and a lot of them have more than one kid. I mean, I think that's just the reality of it. Just most of them choose to have 3 kids instead of 9 kids like I do. Yeah, yeah, see, I think this I mean, I don't know if I would I mean, I think for some people, having a bunch of kids has become kind of a status symbol for them. Um, and I think that's a real problem. I think people should have large families if they want and they feel they can do it. And I would I mean, uh, having 9 kids is amazing. And I wish every couple, if they wanted 9 kids, could have 9 kids, right? I think I wish every couple could have every single kid that they would like to have for themselves. But that's just not reality. And humans are very resourceful. People suffer through a lot of crap largely without complaint because what are you going to do about it? You just do it. You just got to. You don't have a choice. Failure is not an option, so you just do it. You know, is my wife going to die from, being up past 12:30 in the morning last night with our toddler? No, but do you think it's hard on her? Yeah. Do you think if that continues on for a period of time, that is going to be detrimental to her spiritual and physical and mental health? Absolutely. Um, absolutely. And yet, no, we're just assumed. It's just assumed that everyone needs to go through that or ought to go through that. I think that's really wrong. I think that is a bad look for our faith that we just expect people to go through all of that right now. With us or with your wife? You're Speak up, Jonah. We want to hear. Exactly, Pickens. Exactly. Um, and let's see if I should tell this story or not. I don't think I've told. I don't think I've told this story here. Um, so a week. Okay, we need to hear more. I can't imagine how someone like you, I just can't imagine how anyone could put you in the doghouse, Jonah. But let's hear more. But last a couple weeks ago, my wife and I were in Arizona. I was there for work. I was at a conference, and during the conference, we had some small group discussions, and one of the people that were there, and I've kind of known him for a while. Him and his wife, probably my age, maybe a little younger, very successful, whatever, and have no children. And I've never asked why, because it's not really my business why. I don't know if you're Catholic or anything, but just don't have children. Well, during that, he opened up about how him and his wife had wanted children so bad, and couldn't, and he broke down, and he actually pointed to me as he was jealous of the fact that I have all these kids. And it was a real wake up call for me because, as I've said on the show, uh, there are times I sort of resent being as fertile as I am, and while I would never want the hurdles of those that can't have kids at all. Sometimes it'd be nice not to be quite so fertile. And it was so I have a lot of sympathy for people that can't have kids. And I would, in a heartbeat, choose my own lot in life over that if God gave me the choice. But that doesn't mean that I can't talk about the realities of what this life is like, right? Um, so, and that's here's the other problem. Here's the thing that I think often gets overlooked is I think it's really unfair to put couples such as myself who are, let's say, on the higher side of procreation in terms of how many kids we have. um Most of us don't want to come right out and say we kind of resent having as many kids as we do, even though I think some people do, and there are times that I do, like in my heart I do, because I wouldn't give up any of my kids. Like, I know my kids, right? But if I could do it all over again, I would have 5 kids and I'd have 4 kids. I'd have 2 families. I have 2 2 families of, you know, having 9 kids all at once is really, really hard, and actually don't think it's, I just don't think it's actually a good circumstance for most people. I think my kids have really suffered a lot and sacrificed a lot because we have had as many kids as we have had, and we've had, if I'm being honest, we've had as many kids as we have because we've tried to follow what the church says. And if we had the option, let's say, of using contraception or some of these other things, it's unlikely I would have 9 kids. Maybe I'd have 8. Maybe I had 7. I don't know. Yeah, maybe I have 10. Who knows? But it's I think there are a lot of couples who, in their hearts, um, kind of hurt quietly because what are you going to do? You're going to come out and tell the world that you're mad at the church because you had more kids than you wanted because you have those kids. Do you want the last kid to always be like, "Mom and Dad, you didn't want me"? But that's, that is not the way to handle this. We should be able to handle this. Again, we're always told we gotta look at these rules objectively. We can't look at the circumstances. Okay, so stop looking at the circumstances. Let's look at reality. And the reality is that for most people, especially in 2025, adopting the even adopting Humani Vitae, that approach is almost impossible. Um, How many are there? How many Jonas are there? Put your put your put your wife on. I want to talk to her. I, I want to find out why you're in the doghouse. I want to hear it from her directly. So let's go find her. We'll wait. We'll wait here for Mrs. Jonah to show up and give a full accounting. Yeah, sure, sure. So, yeah, as she should be. I'm sorry. Um, Women put up with a lot. Not only have to put up with all these kids, they have to put up with us. So I fully understand why they're upset a lot. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. That's right. We need make it happen, Joanna. I would love to talk to your wife. She she has the better sense than the rest of us, but let's see if we can make that happen. I would love to hear her side of the story. Now I say that as someone who can't get my wife to come on here, but I think she's warming up to it. I think I might be able to get her to talk, but she'll be off camera too. But we'll see if we can get her on sometime and let. I'm a little scared of what she might say too, but we'll see. Anything else? I got to wrap this up. I got to go pick up my kids. Actually, I was hoping to work out, but I think that's not going to happen. So, guys, um, I give up working out. I put on this dad bod for you guys. I want you to know that and make sacrifices to make this stuff happen. I'm just gonna look at my notes here quick before I wrap it up. I think I more or less covered everything that I wanted to cover. Um, let's see here. Mm, yeah, just so we're clear. I mean, I talked about Curran. I don't think he was excommunicated, but he was banned from teaching theology. But uh, we'll all pool in. She can have the biggest bucket of ice cream. Well, does she is she in lockstep with you on all this stuff, Jonah? I suspect not. Tell me that. Is she agree with you? Is she a modern Saint Augustine 2.0? Yeah, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical, but hey, I'll take your word for it. Um, for what it's worth, my wife is more what's the word I should use here? Conservative or scrupulous than I am. So, far as I know, I'm the only heretic in the family. But kidding aside, I mean, this is a conversation I've really wanted to have for a while because I think this is so important. I mean, I think there's still time for the popes, for the church to offer an approach, offer an alternative to the world that people can appreciate and understand, even if they don't fully agree with. But I think I really think that the explanation we have so far is just not very persuasive. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not going to say it makes perfect sense and is persuasive when it just isn't. And if the church would offer up a better explanation for things, that the popes would do that, I'd give my full throated support for that. But I'm not going to just pretend like these these old concepts of philosophy actually make sense when they don't. So anyway, I appreciate you guys showing up. That was a lot of fun. The chat was a lot of fun. I hope you get out of the doghouse soon, Jonah. I hope you have all kinds of wonderful, pleasurable enjoyment with each other, uh, regardless of what St. Augustine says. And appreciate you guys listening. So, um, yeah, leave a comment after the fact if you have any questions or want to continue to rake me over the coals. I'll have a conversation with anyone. So, appreciate you guys. And until next time, everyone, have a good one.